to my October book reviews. I'm going to share with you short reviews and ratings for the 9 books that I read this month. That number's slightly inflated. I had 2 novellas of those 9, and then 2 audiobooks. One I'd been listening to for several months that I just happened to finish at the beginning of the month. And then I had a road trip in the middle of the month, so I was able to knock out another one by the end of the month. But here are the 9 books that I read this month. As with all of these monthly wrap-ups, I like to group them by genre. So if you want to skip a certain genre or skip to a certain genre, I will leave chapters below. But make sure you come back for the book of the month. It's a very good one, and it's somewhat a surprise. I'm kind of surprised that this was my book of the month, but it was fantastic. And actually, it is something that I can recommend to anybody because I think it holds just universal appeal to just about any reader. But let's go ahead and get started with one of those audiobooks that I finished, and that was Me by Elton John. And this is a rock and roll memoir following Elton John. I had liked his music. I'd actually seen him in concert once, coincidentally enough, in Brighton, England on a cricket pitch. But I wouldn't consider myself a big Elton John fan. I do love Billy Joel was kind of my kind of piano rocker. That was kind of the one that I listened to most of my life. But I did like Elton John's music, but this memoir was fantastic. The honesty that he has in this memoir, it's remarkable that he really opens himself up for everything, and he tells you all about the issues that he has with family members that he had along the ways. He's very frank about his sexuality, about drug use and drug abuse, his sobriety. It's a really great memoir. I really enjoyed it. I do love just hearing the stories of these kind of rock and rollers, the things they go through. Some of them are from some of my favorite memoirs. As for the narration, Elton does the first, I should say Sir Elton does the first chapter and the last chapter, but the bulk of it was narrated by Taron Egerton, who portrayed him in the movie Rocket Man, which honestly I haven't seen yet. I need to see it now that I've read this memoir, but the narration was superb. Really, really fantastic. In fact, when I got to the last chapter with Elton, I kind of missed Taron telling the story because his delivery was so good. But this is a really great memoir. It's a great audiobook, and I really enjoyed it. So Me by Elton John, I gave a 5 out of 5. Next book I want to talk about is kind of a self-help, inspirational, I don't really know how to qualify it, but it is a nonfiction work by Rosamund Stone Zander and Benjamin Zander, husband and wife team, and this is called The Art of Possibility. Now, this Benjamin Zander is someone that I knew very, very well. He's a orchestral conductor, pretty famous. He's based out of Boston, and I know his work mostly. He has my favorite TED Talk, and it's called The Art of Classical Music? No, it's called The Transformative Power of Classical Music. I highly recommend that TED Talk. But this book I put down in one sitting. It has a lot of just great little life philosophy and a lot of musical anecdotes. I was mostly here for the anecdotes. But one non-musical anecdote I can share, which kind of gives kind of maybe the thesis statement of this book, is the one that he starts his TED Talk with. It's the very old kind of story about 2 salesmen go to Africa, 2 shoe salesmen go to Africa. And they get there, and the first one wires back to England, shows how old the story is. Wires back to England and says, "It's a disaster. Nobody wears shoes here." And the second salesman says, "What a fantastic opportunity. They don't have shoes yet." And this book is kind of talking about that, how you want to look at the possibilities of life rather than the obstacles in life. And as I said, I put it down in one sitting. I love the musical anecdotes mostly. I don't know if this book's for everybody, but it was a book for me. And I also gave this one a 5 out of 5. All right, up next, I want to talk about a novella by Stephen King called A Face in the Crowd, and it's Stephen King with Stuart Onan. Stuart Onan is the author of The Speed Queen, is the only thing I've read by him, which is a really quick, fast-paced thriller. This is a novella about a widower who's watching a baseball game, and behind home plate, he sees someone who pretty much he thinks is dead, and is pretty sure is dead. And that's all I want to say about it because it's a novella. If I go further, I'm like halfway through the novella as far as what the story is about. But King's collaborations have been more miss than hit, to be honest. But this one works pretty well. I did like when I got to the end that there were just some deeper themes at play rather than just this kind of magical realism like, oh, is he seeing things or is the person come to life, you know what's going on. And I really enjoyed it. It's a quick read. It's about 60 pages, but it's kind of a generous font. I think I read it in about 40 minutes. But I can definitely recommend The Face in the Crowd by Stephen King and Stuart O'Nan. I give it a 4 out of 5. The next book on the list is the other novella, which is part of this kind of cool edition. This is by Richard Chizmar. This is called The Longest December. Now, I haven't been a fan of Chizmar. He did the collaboration with King, the Gwendy trilogy, and he co-wrote the first and third books with King, and then he wrote the second book by himself. I'm not enamored with his writing style, and even in this one, his writing style just, for me, it pulls me out of the story quite often, because there will be something where I'll stop and say, why did he make that word choice? Or he would put just together an analogy or a metaphor that just seems out of place. And he does that so often that I'm constantly torn from the story. The Longest December is a very interesting novella, though. It's longer than A Face in the Crowd. It's about 90 pages, and it's a kind of a smaller font. So it took about almost an hour and a half for me to read it. And it's a really cool premise. It's a great idea for a story. It's just, imagine that the police knock on your door and they want to ask you about your neighbor, who turns out is a serial killer. And this is someone that you thought was a friend and was a part of the family. What happens from there? And it's a great premise. And I will say, despite my misgivings with some of the aspects of Chizmar's writing style, I really enjoyed this one. And at the very end, there was a turn that made me just say, no way, well, with maybe an expletive in there, that I couldn't believe at the very end. And I really enjoyed it. So even though Chizmar isn't an author for me, this is a novella I can recommend. The Longest December, again, about 90 pages. I gave this one a 4 out of 5. So The Longest November was a work of crime fiction. My other work of crime fiction this month was One Shot by Lee Child, which is a Jack Reacher book. I think it's the 9th one. I'm reading them in publication order, and there are at least 20 of them. I'm not really sure. This is the first one, though, that I listened to on audio. And I didn't love the narration at first, but kind of grew on me at the end. He's one of those narrators that I just didn't like the voices that he gave to female characters. They all kind of sounded just like helpless and weak. So I don't know how many audiobooks I'll consume of these Lee Child books, but I will consume more of them, because this latest Jack Reacher book was not one of the best, but it was really solid from start to finish. The whole premise of this one is that Reacher's watching television and he sees that somebody he knows from his days when he was in the military has been accused of being a sniper and shot up all these people in a crowd. So he goes to rural Indiana, to this small town, to see what's going on. And it looks like it's an open and shut case. Or is it? Of course, Reacher is former military police, so he starts to investigate. But this one does not go, even from the start, many directions that you would expect. And I really like that about this one. Crime fiction, a lot of times in these standalones, can be quite formulaic, but I don't think this one was in that vein. But I really enjoyed it. Again, it's not the best Reacher book, but it was a solid 4 out of 5. One Shot by Lee Child. All right, and I had 3 works of fantasy this month. The first one I want to talk about is Fae or Foe by C.A. Deegan. This is the first book in a series called the Cracklock Saga. And this was recommended to me by Peter from P English Literature 2 months ago. And I just ran out of time finishing this in September. I needed another day. So I did finish this at the beginning of October. And I will say that this is perhaps the highest rated book I've seen on Goodreads. It has a 4.88 rating, which I don't know how many ratings there are, but it was at least double digits. That's the highest I've ever seen. So unfortunately, I brought the rating down a little bit because I did not give this 5 stars like it seems like everybody else is doing. But let's talk about it a little bit. First of all, the things I liked about this. This is a work of low fantasy, and it reads kind of young. You have a young protagonist, and kind of this low work of fantasy, you discover Fae and all of these kind of, fairy tale creatures, and he discovers this world that he is somehow a part of that he didn't know existed. The thing that I like most about this book is Deegan's writing style. I really appreciate that even though this reads younger, I don't want to classify it as young adult or middle grade or anything like that, because I think his writing style is quite good. I think a lot of times authors when they're trying to have more universal appeal and being able to appeal to younger readers, simplify things. And I don't feel he did that. I thought the writing style was quite good throughout all of this. So I enjoyed that aspect of it, because sometimes when I do read something that is aimed at perhaps a younger audience, or at least a more universal audience, I feel that the author purposely simplifies things. I don't think Deegan did that very well. I said that incorrectly. Deegan did that very well. I also really liked the world building. I liked this world within a world that he kind of exposed us to in this book, and it was something that I found very interesting, and I thought he did it very, very well. My problem with this book was the ending. It ends pretty much mid-scene, and it's not a cliffhanger. It just kind of ends, like mid-sentence. I haven't been this puzzled by the ending of a book, maybe ever. The only analogy I could come up with was the old television show, well, not real old, Angel, which was a spinoff of Buffy, where the series finale kind of ends in the middle of a scene.
I kind of want to slay the dragon. Let's go to work.
The ending of this book was such a head scratcher for me. It ended with kind of a big action kind of set piece, which was pretty exciting. And you got a little bit of closure for the people in that scene, but all of the other characters that were somewhere else, you're just kind of left hanging. And I know that it's book one of the Cracklock saga, but I don't feel this book ended. And for me, I'm still a month later just scratching my head and wondering narratively why Deegan made the choice to end it where he did. So this is an author that I won't continue this series, but I'll keep an eye out to see what Deegan writes next, because I did like the writing style, and I do think this is an author that has a lot of potential for sure. But as for Fae or Foe, I gave it a like rating, which is a 3 out of 5. All right, next up, let's talk about Under Heaven by Guy Gavriel Kay. After finishing this book, all year, Robert McCammon has been, the front runner for my favorite new author of the year. Well, look out, McCammon, because GGK is right in that conversation right now. Under Heaven is kind of the first of a duology, but the sequel was set, I think, a couple centuries later, so it is kind of a standalone. If you don't know Kay's work, it is always considered historical fantasy, because what he does is he bases his worlds on kind of a period and an area in Earth's past. In this case, I think it's the Tang Dynasty in China, which I think is 7th century. Don't quote me on that. I'm not a scholar. I don't know a lot of Eastern history. But it's an Eastern setting. And what I loved most about this book, besides Kay's writing style, which is, stupendous, superb, all the superlatives. I love the writing style. What I really liked about this is I had no idea where the story was going. We get a main character that is kind of off away from, because he's in mourning from where his father died, and he's off away from kind of the center of this empire, and things start to happen, and each chapter I just wondered where this was going. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed just watching this character and seeing him kind of deal with all these different things that happen, because it's almost like with him, he didn't know where the story was going either. But it turns into kind of a book with a lot of political intrigue, which I didn't expect that at first. This one has a little bit more fantasy elements than the previous book of Kay's that I read, which was The Lions of Al-Razan, which I love that one. 5-star read, one of my best books of the year. And this one had just a little bit more, had to do with kind of like dealing with death. And I liked that, but it's still very low on the fantasy elements. In fact, this book, it was very interesting because the fantasy elements are toned down, and there are some big battles, and most of them happen off the page. And that happened a little bit in The Lions of Al-Razan. And I kind of like it. And it's not that I don't like seeing battles on the page, but sometimes they might not be necessary, because sometimes the aftermath is a lot more interesting. I love Kay's writing in that you have to hang on every word, because sometimes he'll give you a single sentence at the end of a paragraph that totally flips everything that's going on, or everything that you thought you knew was going on. Kay is a treat to read. I mentioned, because I'm filming this later, I finished a third book of his, and something I'll say now, and I think it sums up for me with Kay, is when I'm reading a book by Guy Gavriel Kay, it reminds me why I love to read, because he just flat out knows how to write. He knows how to write everything well: character, world building, plotting, subtle thematic areas within all of those things. And Under Heaven had a great beginning, a great middle, and an end. It's a thick book, but man, this was enjoyable from the very beginning. Under Heaven, my second book by Guy Gavriel Kay, is the second one that I've given a 5 out of 5. I will be reading a lot more Kay in the next couple years. I firmly believe that's going to happen for me. Up next, another work of fantasy, and this one's by Philip Chase, and this is The Prophet of Edan. And this is the second book of the Edan trilogy. Now, I will warn you, this might go on a little longer. I was going to perhaps do a full review, but I might save that for the series, or then I thought maybe I'd do a dual review with another book. And anyway, I'm just going to talk about this one a little bit. So I'll get my rating out of the way. This one's a solid 4 out of 5. It's a really great book. I think you should read this series, but I want to talk about it a little bit more. So here we go. So Prophet of Edan right away starts much differently. It's not a spoiler because you see it here, but we get dragons in this book. And I love that aspect of it. And you see it right away. So it's not a spoiler. It's literally on the back of the book. This one took a while to get started for me. The first 150 pages, what Chase was doing was kind of expanding the world and showing you different people in different places and what was going on in this continent, basically to show you that this isn't just a small holy war that was started in the first book, but it has expanded all across the continent, and we see a lot of different people in a lot of different places. For me, it took a while to get started because it didn't have a lot of momentum. A lot of these introductions of places, it was kind of like introduce character, big battle commences. Introduce another character, big battle commences. And I was kind of having a little bit of battle fatigue early on in this book. I was also coming off of GGK, who didn't give me battle sequences, and I was loving it. So I think it suffered a little bit by contrast in that mind, which is unfair for a second book by an author versus, a master that some consider the best the genre's seen in the last couple decades. So that was probably unfair for Chase. But once it got going, I really enjoyed this, because early on, I just wanted to see Dayraven and Sakara, my two favorite characters from the first book. Sakara more than Dayraven, but I will say this book, my esteem and love for the character of Dayraven kind of surpassed Sakara's. We got a lot more of him. The first book was kind of a coming-of-age tale for him, but we see even more of his growth in this story. And the more that we saw his growth, the more I liked the character. One thing that I really liked about the character of Dayraven is inwardly he is a reluctant hero, but outwardly he does what needs done. I hate the reluctant hero in fiction. It's something that it's not something I'm a fan of. But in this case, when they're maybe inwardly reluctant, but they still do what needs done, I really like characters like that. And I guess I dislike outwardly reluctant heroes. That's why I stopped reading Terry Brooks, but I guess that's a discussion for another video. Anyway, I really liked Dayraven because we saw the conflict within while he was still doing what needed to be done for the greater good. And I really liked that aspect of it. I liked, once we got going, even though the focus on the story, I think, was a lot more focused in general, I did like the different point of views where we got to see a lot of different people on different sides of this, including Bledla, who's kind of the big bad in this series, seeing that he is just simply a religious zealot and seeing him less as a kind of two-dimensional villain, seeing that he's just a true believer in what he believes in. And perhaps the king that he's manipulating is even a worse villain than him. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And this one had a superb ending. The ending of this book, without going into spoilers, was really great. The very end is what I want to say. There's kind of an ending of the main story, and then there's an epilogue where it's just like, oh, where's he going to take that? And I love when an author does that, where he finishes the book and then shows you kind of glimpses of where it's going to go, and it's a place that you didn't even consider it was going. So I really, really liked that. It seems like I'm talking about writing style a lot in this video, so let me just say that I think that's Chase's strength. I think he just is very much a wordsmith. I think that he is very clear in his prose, but it's not simplistic. I talked about that a little bit with Deegan's writing style, and I see a lot of parallels to this here, but I think there's even further, there's a little bit more richness. The point I made at this point in my video, I kind of rambled a little bit, so let me be a little more succinct. I really appreciate the way that Chase uses kind of an archaic kind of writing, at least in the speech of the characters, and how that just kind of subtly seeps its way into descriptions and things like that. It makes it feel like classic fantasy, even though there's a lot more modern elements, and I really love that aspect of Chase's writing style. When I encounter really good writing, I notice it a lot more, and I did notice it with this book, so I do like Chase's writing style quite a bit. If I have one complaint about the ending of this book, it's that the thing, how do I say it without spoiler? Something happens to a main character which will propel you, I think, into the last book. And you started to see glimpses of this thing happening to this main character. I kind of wanted a little bit more of it. Like another 20 or 30 pages of seeing glimpses of what's happening to this character. I felt the very end was just a little rushed for my taste. People will probably disagree with that and think that it was perfectly done, but I think a little bit more, I would have personally been okay with it. But overall, I really enjoyed The Prophet of Edan. I think I liked the first book a little bit more than the second book, but I'm very, very intrigued to see where Chase is going to take this in Return to Edan in the final book, which I will be reading in November. But as for The Prophet of Edan, I gave it a solid 4 out of 5, and I look forward to seeing where the series is going next. And my book of the month. Well, my book of the month is only a surprise because it's a short story collection, and that is The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories by Ken Liu. I knew this was going to be great because virtually every person I've seen talk about this short story collection just raves about it, and I figure they can't all be wrong. And they were right. This is the book that Kyle recommended for me to read in October, so I'm always happy when the recommendation ends up as my book of the month because this was absolutely fantastic. There were 2 stories in here that actually made me emotional, and that's tough for a short story collection. I think it's an uphill battle because you're not with a character or characters long enough in any of these stories to really connect, but man, Ken Liu's very good at this. What surprised me most about this collection is I was expecting a bunch of fantasy tales because he's most famous for, I just forgot the name of it, his 4-book series, The Dandelion Dynasty. There it is. Oh, geez, forgot that. Which I haven't read yet, but so I thought he was a fantasy writer, but very few of these had fantasy elements. There were, in fact, more science fiction short stories in here than anything. But the one thing I want to mention with this that I loved most is thematically, a lot of these share discussions on culture. And I think that has to do with Ken Liu. I'm pretty sure he's a Chinese American, and that informed kind of his life and just his experiences. And he puts that into these stories quite a bit. Whether it's a modern day, it's a work of historical fiction, it's a work of science fiction, he kind of wove that into a lot of these stories. And it's not just kind of immigrant stories or East versus West kind of cultural discussions. A lot of times, like there's one that's Chinese versus Japanese. And I really enjoy this. It's something that I just enjoy in life, not just in literature. I mean, some of my favorite books talk about this. Shogun, probably the biggest obvious one. The thing that I loved most about that book was the discussion of different cultures and the cross-cultural learning and cross-cultural connection in that book. It's something that I enjoyed quite a bit in the Empire trilogy by Raymond E. Feist and Janie Wirtz recently. Even though that's a fantasy story, it was kind of Eastern and Western elements, and seeing characters from those different elements kind of connect and learn from one another. It's something I don't ever get old seeing it on the page. And part of it's kind of my life too. I mean, the school that I teach at, I saw a statistic from one of our teachers the other day. We have 40 different languages represented at home. in our campus and 70 different languages spoken on our campus. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons we're so successful as a campus is that diversity. And I always love learning about that in real life. And when I see it in literature, I love it quite a bit. So just seeing the different cultural things treated as almost thematic ideas in a lot of these short stories just caused me to connect. But this is, for me, I think, a great short story collection for anybody because there's a little bit of so many different aspects that you may enjoy, whether you're a fantasy or a sci-fi or a mainstream fiction reader. I can recommend for anybody The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories by Ken Liu, easy 5 out of 5, and my book of the month for October 2023. Well, that is my month. 9 books. It took a while. I know I probably blathered on a little longer than normal for these book reviews. But hey, if you read any of these, I'd love to talk with you in the comments section below. Just label any spoilers in case someone hasn't read them, goes looking in the comments section. I'd also love to hear what your book of the month was in October. Did you have a great month like me? I really enjoyed all of these books, and my book of the month is one of the best short story collections I've ever read. So that's a successful month in my mind. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter and Goodreads. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.